At odds. Lydia hadn't slept that night. There had been too many thoughts occupying her mind. Edgar had said they ought to return to London the next day. Nothing had been solved, and though Lydia didn't want to abandon Virginia or Lady Ortred, she didn't see what she could accomplish by staying. Besides, she no longer believed herself capable of defying Edgar any further and carrying on by herself, and she worried that any more stubbornness on her part would only hurt him more than she already had. The only reason she had mentioned cancelling their engagement was to give him a chance to reassure her that he wouldn't. And although he had done so, she knew that even suggesting it had hurt him. "What are you thinking about presently? That you might flee from me?" That hadn't been anywhere near the content of her thoughts. Rather, she had been marveling at how small her kneecaps must have been to fit in his hands. She wanted to become the girl that he wanted her to be, but she just didn't know how. Hoping that Lady Ortred's education would be the key, she had devoted all her efforts to it. When it had fallen apart, she'd felt less deserving than ever of becoming Edgar's wife. By the time the sky started to lighten, her mind was still stuck fast between the options of leaving and staying. "Wake up, Lydia." Nico was knocking on the skylight. She had to force herself to sit up. "I am awake." "Come quickly. I've found where the Danes gather." That had her casting her blanket aside. She was dressed and out of the room at once. She followed Nico into a cozy study with a terrace that overlooked the courtyard. "See the fairy footprints all over this room? A lot of them are fresh. Seems they come and go all the time." Lydia couldn't see fairy footprints especially clearly, but she believed Nico when he said they were there. She surmised that this was the study of a previous generation's Earl. It was very tidy and without a hint of dust, but the well-used armchair and desk spoke to outdated tastes. The Danes have had a connection with the head of this estate for several generations. I wonder if they come to this room to remember those who used it previously. Lady Ortred had no children, so her late husband's earldom would be passed to his kin. Lydia didn't know whether the kin in question would hold any fondness for the land their ancestors occupied, but she foresaw the fairies struggling to accept someone who had long left this place as head of the household. Either way, the Danes may have felt that leaving was their only choice. What sort of contract had Lady Ortred made with them exactly? Where had she gone and why, going so far as to leave a fairy in her place? Was there something with which she required their help before they left? Perhaps that was what had led her to make such an irresponsible promise. Lydia looked around. She wondered if the portraits on the walls were of the estate's former inhabitants who had created close links with the Danes. It would explain why they frequented the room. Her eyes eventually fell on one particular painting that featured a lady in rather old-fashioned clothing with a wreath of flowers around her neck. The flowers were of all different colors, and Lydia was surprised to find that she recognized the wreath. It was the same one Virginia had been wearing. The variety of flowers, their sizes, and the order of the colors. What could it mean? Had it resisted wilting all these years to end up adorning the gardener's neck? Had Virginia made a new wreath based on the one in the portrait? What for? Lydia realized she was assuming they were real flowers when they could have been artificial. "Wait a moment, regard," she murmured. The rubies were the crimson roses, the emerald the green leaves, the garnet the scarlet amaryllis, the amethyst the violet forget-me-nots, and the diamond the white roses. Taking the first letter of each of those gems spelled out a message of affection, regard. Did that make the wreath Lady Ortred's regard necklace? Virginia had said that wearing it allowed her into the fairies' garden. Fae and flowers held a strong connection to one another. Lydia had assumed that wearing it simply made finding the garden's entrance easier. However, if it was actually the regard necklace that had been passed down through generations, it potentially symbolized that its wearer had permission to enter the Danes' garden. According to Lucinda, the necklace used flowers in its motif, and the butler had said that it was too splendid to wear on a day-to-day basis. "Nico, I have come to a realization." "What's that?" The gardener, Virginia, was Lady Ortred. That was why she was now trapped in the rose garden, because the fairy that had taken her place had been chased away. The regard necklace had not been stolen. Lady Ortred still had it. I know where her ladyship's regard necklace is. But I would like to go and confirm my suspicions. It wasn't uncommon for noble women to enjoy gardening, and this countess's specialty lay in roses. She must have tended the rose garden as a matter of course. Go where, Lydia? Nico asked. If she was right and the gardener and the countess were one and the same, then it was clear what she must do. Grasping at that glimmer of hope, Lydia rushed for the study door but stopped in her tracks as someone appeared right before her. Hello. Starting early this morning, are we? It was Billy. He kept one hand on the door and didn't move from her way. She wondered whether he had overheard what she'd said to Nico. Most people heard the fairy cat's speech as mules, so it would have sounded like she was having a peculiar conversation with herself. You too, I gather, she said. I was just about to come looking for you. Might I have a word? Can it wait? It won't take long. One of the maids found Lady Lucinda's brooch. She wished to apologize to you, for she believes you wouldn't have come under suspicion if she'd returned it sooner. Oh. Will you see her? Lydia nodded. The mornings before their duties began tended to be the only free time afforded to junior maids. Casting Nico a look to instruct him to wait for her, she followed Billy from the room. Mr. Nico, your breakfast is ready. Are you dozing, perhaps? The mention of breakfast woke Nico up quickly. He had been waiting for Lydia by the study window when he had fallen asleep. The chairs here were exceedingly comfortable. Oh, it's you, Raven. I suppose I am hungry. Hold on, where's Lydia? Hasn't she come back yet? I was actually searching for Miss Carlton myself. I remember now. A servant called Billy called her away. He was saying something about a maid picking up Lucinda's brooch. What did you just say? It wasn't Raven who cried out, but Edgar, who had appeared in the doorway. He must have been searching for Lydia alongside his servant. His face was pale as he swooped in to pick Nico up by the scruff of his neck. Nico, surely you cannot be telling me that Lydia went somewhere with Billy and has yet to return? Oi! Unhand me. Why must you get so unreasonably jealous of every man who comes within a stone's throw of her? Did she say anything else? For example, anything concerning Lady Orchard's regard necklace? She did, as it happens. She said she'd come to a realization about where the Countess's necklace was. It was all very sudden. Edgar clicked his tongue and practically tossed Nico to one side. Raven, find Billy and Lydia as soon as you can. Yes, my lord. How dare you throw me? Nico wailed. Jealousy has twisted you. You are a petty fiend of a man. This has nothing to do with jealousy. Lydia is in danger, the Earl explained urgently. Lydia followed Billy behind the stables. There wasn't a maid to be seen. Instead, she found herself confronted with two male servants, neither of them high-ranking. The three men surrounded her before she could even guess at what was happening. You're not really a maid, are you, Lydia? Billy asked. The look on his face was utterly terrifying, and she couldn't understand why the discovery of her secret should warrant it. Where is Lady Orchard? I'm sorry. Where is the Countess? And where is her regard necklace? Who are you people? Lydia asked. You don't need to know that to answer my questions. Billy was overbearing in his assertiveness, and Lydia found herself backed up against the wall. Even so, she shot back, I suppose you aren't really a footman either. No, I'm not. So I suggest you take me seriously. Billy slammed his hand at full force against the wall behind her. You're the one who abducted Lady Orchard and fabricated that little trick with the rabbit in her chamber, aren't you? I never swallowed that slop about fairies, unlike the superstitious old butler. Lydia looked up at him in surprise. I did no such thing. It had been the work of whoever was after her ladyship's jewels. I know you were chasing those rabbits around the gardens. And we discovered a dead rabbit in her ladyship's room. It must have been you. But you can't have acted alone. Who are you working with? Where is the Countess? I don't. You can't tell us you don't know. One of the other men flashed a knife right in front of her eyes. "We know you've been snooping around the estate whenever you're not on duty," Billy went on. "I imagine you've failed to find the necklace even after locking up her ladyship. You've been looking for it ever since, haven't you?" In truth, she had been searching for the Danes. However, it seemed that Billy had decided that she was the thief with her eye on the Countess's jewelry. These men appeared to be after it too. "Billy, are you and these men, are you a group of thieves? Were you pretending to be servants so that you could steal Lady Orchard's jewels?" The man with the knife opened his mouth to speak, but Billy gestured for him to keep quiet and answered in his stead. "You're working with that blonde earl, aren't you? Well, the man pretending to be an earl, I suppose. Any nobleman whose servant holds that much unconcealed bloodlust can't be who he says he is." Lydia forced herself to think. Whoever had snuck into Lady Orchard's room with a knife wasn't affiliated with these men. Did that mean there was another thief after the Countess's jewels? Or was it instead an attempted murder? "If you talk, Lydia, we'll share the spoils with you. You'd rather that than us killing you here, wouldn't you?" Billy offered calmly, his eyes oddly soothing as they peered at her. She glared at him and kept her mouth firmly shut. "You were let go from your previous estate because you seduced a man, is that right? I can't imagine that from a girl who looks like you." Lucinda's lies had apparently made their way to him too. There was no greater humiliation for a young woman than to be seen as a temptress. Lydia could barely contain her frustration. She was trembling with rage, which Billy seemed to interpret as fear. "I'm not opposed to girls like that, you know. I don't push them around either. You'd have a much easier time of it with me than that blonde scoundrel." He touched her cheek, sending goosebumps along her skin. "Don't you dare touch me." Lydia raised her hand to strike him, but he caught it before she could. He pinned her wrist against the wall before continuing, the words he spat out landing somewhere between persuasion and threat. "We don't take kindly to those who steal what is ours from under our noses. It won't be long before your companion ends up as fertilizer for these gardens either. Is he really worth risking your life over? I doubt he cares about what's happening to you right now." Lydia's hand still bore the red marks from yesterday's punishment. Billy studied them pityingly. Sensing that he had let his guard down for a moment, Lydia tried shoving him away. She struggled as best she could, trying to escape, but it was no use. One of the other men hooked his arms under hers from behind and held her tight. Billy's hand came to rest on her throat. "Listen to me. That fop you're hanging around is probably only interested in your looks any." Billy suddenly jumped backward. The man behind Lydia collapsed, and she almost went down with him, until a dark-skinned boy darted in to support her. "Raven." He looked at Billy and one of the other men, the threat clear in his eyes. "You really have no idea how to seduce a woman, do you?" Edgar had appeared from the other side of the stables, dragging with him a man whose hands were tied behind his back, presumably another one of Billy's associates. He was staggering and struggling to stay vertical, having clearly suffered a substantial beating. A cold smile rose to Edgar's lips as he showed the man's condition to Billy. "Not to mention the foolish courage it must have taken to try to seduce my fiancé in the first place." Edgar kicked the bound man to the ground, and Raven immediately pushed Lydia toward him in a manner that seemed planned. The servant leaped at Billy in the same movement. The footman moved his hand toward his inner pocket to draw a weapon, but Raven was faster. The boy kicked upward, and a pistol went flying out of Billy's hand. Lydia tried to duck around the footman, running toward Edgar who was reaching out for her. Suddenly, however, a wave of dizziness washed over her. She lost her footing, the world spinning around her. Edgar cried her name. It sounded so far away. Lydia was struggling to summon strength to her muscles. It felt like her taut nerves had snapped all too suddenly. All her recent anxiety and exhaustion had come to the surface, and she didn't know what to do with her body, which refused to listen to her. Instead, she did what she could to maintain consciousness. Her eyes wouldn't open, so she considered where she might presently be lying. The freshly washed linen, feather pillow, and soft mattress meant she definitely wasn't in the crude bed of her attic room. Someone was holding her hand. Edgar. Though her lips moved slightly, her voice wouldn't come. But it was enough to restore a tiny portion of her strength. She managed to crack her eyelids open. Edgar was looking at her intently with a grave expression on his face, stroking her hand as he held it in his. Embarrassed as she recalled the marks that still covered it, she wanted to pull away, but she didn't yet have the strength. This must have been Edgar's guest room. His chamber. Despite being unable to move, she grew flustered. Edgar stood up then. Her heart lurched, but then she realized that he had turned toward the door. He had a visitor. Has the doctor arrived yet? He asked. I beg you forgive the trouble we have caused you, Lord Ashenbert. We shall carry Lydia to her room. Your lordship will not need to trouble yourself over her any longer. The fairy doctor was finally able to move her head. She saw Mrs. Boyle ushering in a junior male servant. You will do no such thing without my permission, Edgar said firmly. A maid cannot be allowed to occupy one of the guest rooms. Bring the doctor here at once. This is common with maids. She will be right as rain tomorrow. Oh, she will she? Perhaps something had snapped inside Edgar at the thought of the housekeeper moving his fiancée without so much as calling a doctor. He had taken a much darker tone than usual. He might have raised his voice if he wasn't under the impression that Lydia was asleep. Listen closely. Lydia is not a maid. She is my fiancée. I shall not abide anything untoward happening to her. Should that happen, both you and the maids who harassed her will find yourselves buried alive. Edgar stood in front of the bed, preventing the servant from taking so much as a step toward her. It was evident that his patience had run dry. The housekeeper looked both pitying and conflicted all at once. The Earl's infatuation with a mere servant seemed to have bewildered her. My lord, she began hesitantly, Lydia is an employee of this estate. She must be treated in line with the other servants, else it would set a bad precedent. I do not know what Lady Ortred told you about Lydia. However, I did not entrust her to you. I entrusted her to her ladyship, in whom I have confidence. I should have put a stop to this ordeal much sooner, given her absence. Never did I anticipate that my fiancé would be exposed to such cruelty. Lydia might have been tasked with attending to her ladyship directly, but I am the one who is ultimately responsible for and holds authority over her. Edgar only grew more irritated as the housekeeper failed to grasp his point. As I have already explained, Lydia is not a maid in any capacity. I asked the Duchess to request that Lady Ortred educate her, so that she might be prepared to enter into upper-class society. Her ladyship kindly accepted. I fail to see how that gives you responsibility or authority over Lydia. I shall have you know that her ladyship was to potentially recommend that Lydia be allowed an audience with Her Majesty. You understand the gravity of that, don't you? I held my tongue, believing that this was all a part of her ladyship's education, but I refused to stay silent any longer. Lydia caught a glimpse of the butler standing in the doorway. He must have heard the commotion in passing and stopped to see what was going on. Edgar continued berating the housekeeper regardless. What is more, I might ask for an explanation as to the caning she received. That is how one punishes a common thief, is it not? Were you the one responsible for that? Was it not proven that Lydia was innocent of pilfering Lady Lucinda's brooch? Well, you do realize whose hand it was that you marked so brutally, don't you? Although Mrs. Boyle had been dauntless in refuting Edgar's words just seconds again, now her expression was gradually growing more anxious. I knew we were receiving a very important young lady, but I thought she was due to arrive tomorrow. Her arrival was moved up due to unforeseen circumstances on the part of the Duchess. She must have sent word. Lord Ashenbert, I must beg your forgiveness, the butler cut in hurriedly. We did receive such a telegram, and it was delivered to her ladyship's chamber. I believe it is quite likely that she was never able to read it. It is still among the unopened letters in her room, so she must have already been absent at the time of its arrival. But if not Lady Ortred, who decided that Lydia should work as a maid? It was a pertinent question, Lydia realized, and she put her hazy mind to work. "Ah, yes," Mrs. Boyle began, but then she faltered. She frowned as if still struggling to comprehend the situation. The butler answered in her stead. "The new maid has just arrived." The collapse of the main bridge meant the road was closed for quite some time. At that, the housekeeper swooned. If the butler hadn't been standing behind her and caught her, she might have hit her head. As Lydia understood it, Lady Ortred had not ordained that she become a maid. Because she had switched places with the fairy and been in the rose garden, she had missed the news that Lydia was due to arrive early. The fairy doctor had just so happened to come on the day the new maid was due, leading to the housekeeper's misapprehension. "I beg your pardon. Did you not think to check? And now Lydia has been taken ill. This is no insignificant mistake." Edgar, finally able to speak, Lydia managed to shift herself up slightly. "I ought to have checked myself. I simply assumed that it was all a part of my training." "Do not push yourself, Lydia. You need to remain lying down." "I'm fine. But none of this is Mrs. Boyle's fault." In fact, she couldn't blame the housekeeper at all for her mistake. A young noblewoman from a respectable house would normally never have arrived by herself and without a lady's maid. Nor would she have simply accepted being mistaken for a servant. None of this would have happened if Lydia wasn't a commoner. She tried again. "All right. I shan't blame her any further, so lie back down. Your countenance is still rather concerning." "I feel fine. Just a little weak." Edgar knelt down and peered at her anxiously. "When was the last time you ate something? You haven't been taking meals regularly, have you?" Now that she thought about it, he might have been right. "I ate the cookie you gave me. Well, as much as I was able to." The Earl drew his hand over her cheek before pulling her into a comforting embrace. He looked over his shoulder at the housekeeper and butler. "Summon a doctor and bring her some food. Post haste." Edgar left the room to allow the doctor to examine Lydia. Apart from the relief, which had been a long time coming, he also found himself saddled with an unmanageable rage. Despite his proximity to Lydia, he had been unable to protect her. It had been difficult to intervene when everyone thought her a servant. He was an earl and she a maid. It had essentially left him powerless. The more he'd tried to help, the more the other maids had grown jealous and spread those unseemly rumors about her. Ultimately, he'd had to make her true position known just to get the housekeeper to summon a doctor. The experience had reminded him that Lydia was liable to continuously encounter similar hardships when she entered noble society. There was no getting away from the fact that he was an aristocrat and she wasn't. He could stand up for her all he liked, but it would do nothing to change things. That was precisely why he had wanted to raise her status as much as possible before announcing their engagement. If he could make it so her father's respectable profession outweighed her upper-middle-class position, it would give her a much easier time when she did enter upper-class society. That was the last trick he held up his sleeve. But he wasn't sure he could still use it, given that Lady Ortred was missing. And he was starting to wonder whether it even mattered. He didn't want to force Lydia into anything. Leaving London once they were married and living out the rest of their days peacefully on his Isle of Monon was also an option. While he wasn't sure how long he would be able to maintain his sanity, it was an area teeming with fairies, so it would be a comfortable environment for her. He wanted to give everything of his to her before disaster struck. That had been his intention this entire time. In a sense, he considered noble society a potential weapon for keeping her safe, hence why he wanted to carve out a place for her there. But if it proved too difficult, there would be nothing to be done. He had witnessed Lydia collapse from exhaustion right in front of him, and it had sapped him of the motivation to keep forcing things to progress. "I am back, my lord." Edgar turned his gaze from the window to his servant. "And what of Billy and his men?" "I threw them into the manure pit by the stables." "My heart breaks for them," Edgar said, quietly thinking that it was what they deserved. "Did they talk?" "No, my lord. They gave me the impression that they would die rather than let anything slip." In other words, they had been trained. It didn't surprise the Earl, given his first impression of Billy. Raven was capable of immediately identifying whether threats were enough to extract information from someone or whether it would require a special kind of torture. Discerning that this lot fell into the latter category, he must have given up trying to question them. It would have taken a specialized location and tools to get anything from them, neither of which existed within the estate. Edgar suspected that they had been more than just a gang of thieves. My lord, they were not the ones responsible for entering Lady Orchard's room with the knife, were they? It would seem not, and I have my suspicions surrounding that maid. Perhaps this estate has been penetrated by two separate gangs. Edgar had been looking into Lucinda's maid as much as he had Billy since yesterday. He had learned that she was not plotting something alone, but had been keeping in frequent contact with somebody, one of the men staying in the cabin on the grounds, hired to transplant the garden's trees. It was possible that they were all her accomplices. Lucinda believed the maid to be mute, and the girl would have had to exercise extreme caution not to break the illusion. She had likely targeted Lucinda upon hearing that she was Lady Orchard's niece and would be staying with the Countess to prepare for her debut. No one would have questioned her wandering the estate as the young lady's maid, and it would have given her the opportunity to get closer to the Countess too. What about Lady Lucinda herself? Raven asked. The mystery of the dark hair has yet to be solved. Edgar had been observing the girl in question for some time from the window. She was carrying a whitish box, most likely the ivory jewelry box, in her arms. The box from which Lydia had allegedly stolen her brooch. The butler had said that it belonged to Lady Orchard and had been out on display when Lucinda requested use of it. The girl was carefully observing her surroundings as she entered the domed greenhouse with it. When she emerged again, she held nothing. What could she be scheming this time? A pertinent question. It is difficult to know how to interpret her movements. That said, she seemed to be putting most of her efforts into harassing Lydia rather than anything as audacious as jewel thievery or making an attempt on a noblewoman's life. In any case, Raven, it is no longer feasible to bring Lydia back to London too soon. We ought to thoroughly dispatch these dangerous parties first. Yes, my lord. It is my impression that Lady Lucinda's maid is likely to be more loose-lipped than Billy. Your thoughts? I cannot foresee extracting information from her to be too difficult a task, given she can speak after all. She might also know whether or not Lady Lucinda was involved in the intrusion of Lady Orchard's room, which would eliminate the need to question the girl. Raven had probably already deduced everything Edgar was thinking. He nodded obediently, then turned on his heel. Lydia had made herself take a little soup despite her lack of appetite and was now feeling somewhat calmer. The doctor had said that her dizziness was likely a result of exhaustion and stress, and that she would recover after a period of rest. The news had finally wiped away the grave expression on Edgar's face. The Earl was presently sitting by her on the edge of the bed and studying her thoughtfully. As usual, witnessing his handsome features in all their intensity at such proximity was making her restless. She nonchalantly averted her gaze, her hands fiddling aimlessly with her duvet. I wasted vast amounts of time and effort, didn't I? My stubbornness caused you no end of trouble. I was foolish. I do not feel inconvenienced in the least, Lydia. But everyone knows that we are engaged now. There is no shortage of maids who still believe I stole Lady Lucinda's brooch either. Let them believe what they wish. I know better than anyone else that you are innocent. I made you wash those pots and casks. There is nothing I wouldn't wash for you. And now I am monopolizing your bed. You are very welcome to. It grants me a pretext to sleep beside you. You intend to sleep here? She grew flustered, eliciting a sigh from Edgar, but it was not without amusement. I wish that wouldn't frighten you so. I am your lover, not a wolf. I know that, she stammered. It was because they were lovers that Lydia struggled with her response. She could no longer rely on temper and rejection to cover for her embarrassment and awkwardness, but she was still unused to being in love, so it was equally difficult to give herself over to the amorous mood. The more she panicked, the more ungainly her behavior became. That was in jest. I shall be sleeping in the room next door. Lydia knew her relief was palpable, and she could sense the resultant frown on his face. You still won't look at me. Do you perhaps blame me for all that has happened? Or do you perhaps blame the fact that we are engaged? No. Then, do you suspect there is something between Lady Lucinda and me? You never wrote her any letters. She only assumed it was you. What is there to suspect? That I might have taken advantage of her fondness for me? The thought hadn't eluded Lydia. Did you? Not in the slightest. She fell silent. As she recalled, they had almost kissed. But perhaps that was to be expected. Any man would have been swayed were he desired so earnestly. Lady Lucinda is rather beautiful, Lydia said, and she has confidence in herself. I should think it would only be natural for you to develop an interest in her, given that she is so fond of you. This time, Edgar was silent. He seemed to mull over her words for a spell. She suspected that she had hit the nail on the head, but he came out with something rather unexpected. Personally, I would find it most unpleasant if you were to develop an interest in other men, he grumbled. But it is impossible to have full control over one another's hearts, no matter how close we are as lovers. He let out a long sigh, and she could only wonder at the emotion that had elicited it. Her gaze was downcast, so she couldn't see his expression. But she heard his words. Lydia, I want all of you. That was what she wanted from him too. That was why she had agreed to marry him. No other man had ever reached her heart like he had. So why did he speak as if such a risk existed? She let her eyes creep upward, hoping to catch a clue in his countenance. She couldn't yet bring herself to look him in the eye, so she let her gaze settle on the almost translucent golden hair by his ear. He reached out for her, tilting her chin upward and resting his thumb on her lips. Perhaps he was waiting to see if she would pull back. But he soon brought their lips together, pressing his softly against hers. Lydia struggled with their kisses when they were alone. Edgar liked them to last, and she never knew what she was supposed to do. When she stayed still, she was bewildered by the unfamiliar feelings within her. There was something akin to sadness, helplessness, a fear that she might lose herself, and an exhilarating urge to know what that would feel like. It was the utter confusion of it all that paralyzed her. Her nerves were locking her limbs in place. There came a knock at the door. Edgar ignored it and gently deepened their kiss, pulling her in tightly. A maid called to them from outside. Lord Ashenbert. Lady Lucinda is here to see you. No. Don't stop. Surprised at the thought that flitted across her mind, Lydia turned her face away thoughtlessly. It seemed that Edgar wasn't satisfied, because he continued to rain kisses on her cheeks and ears as the maid knocked again. Edgar, the door. What reason have I to respond? Well, it might be important. He was peering at her, and she was made to look away once again. He got to his feet with a quiet sigh. I shan't be long. The chamber door closed behind him. Edgar must have let Lucinda into the dressing room, because Lydia could hear her voice. I require your assistance, Lord Ashenbert. Annie has gone missing. Her voice was thick with tears. Annie? Ah, you must be referring to your maid. I sent her to father's room for an errand, but he said she never arrived. It has been an hour now, and I've seen neither hide nor hair of her. Perhaps you ought to wait a little longer. She might merely be taking a break somewhere. My lord, this is a first for her. I can only think that something dreadful has happened, especially with that jewel thief lurking about the estate. Lydia gasped as something in her chest jolted. Lucinda didn't know that someone was after Lady Orchard's jewels. So when she said jewel thief, she must have been referring to the fairy doctor. Annie took the jewelry box with her. I thought it best to leave it with father, given all the trouble we've been having. Yes, I'm sure of it. Lydia must have stolen the box from Annie. Lady Lucinda, you may recall that we proved Lydia's innocence yesterday. I am certain that she merely hid the brooch elsewhere. She would never do such a thing. My lord, why do you defend her so? Well, I suppose I do understand to some extent. Gentlemen prefer to keep several lovers, don't they? A maid must make for a fun, casual diversion. And if her presence should cause problems, one has only to dismiss her. There came the dragging of fabric over the floor. Presumably, Lucinda had just drawn closer to Edgar. Uneasiness bubbled up in Lydia's stomach. I understand that ladies tend to be very tolerant when it comes to such matters. However, my lord, a nobleman must choose a woman from a respectable family to marry so that his estate may be passed on to an heir of suitable caliber. And you consider yourself to be just such a woman? Well, my offspring would certainly be fit to inherit an earldom. You might have put that more euphemistically. Lydia wondered if Edgar was presently enjoying himself. She knew that he would never spurn a woman who approached him so forthrightly. As much as she tried to resign herself to that fact, the irritation started to build within her. Not to mention that the conversation was moving on from the topic of Annie's whereabouts. It was apparent that Lucinda was only using her maid as an excuse to flirt with Edgar. I do believe myself capable of choosing maids who are both obedient and endearing, Lucinda went on. Edgar hummed. In other words, you would permit disloyalty with women of your choosing. What a scoundrel. Why had that made him chuckle? Lydia grew all the more irritated. Yes. Why, there are plenty of maids much lovelier than Lydia. Are there now? Before she knew what she was doing, Lydia had risen from bed and flung open the dressing room door. That's enough. I do not care how much you adore Edgar, you will stay away from him. I would rather he fool around with 1,000 different women before you. Lucinda stared at her, dumbfounded. Then, after a moment of studying Lydia, who was still in her maid's uniform, she seemed to return to her senses and shot back. Fool around, you say? I am daughter to Lord Constable. I am not to be fooled around with. And who are you? A mere maid. I am no maid. I am Lord Ashenbert's rightful fiancée. I may not know how prestigious your name is, but no one will become his mistress without my acknowledgement. Lydia. Edgar extended his arms toward her as she staggered. For some reason, the very sight of him made her rage peak, and she raised her hand thoughtlessly. Don't touch me. Her strike hit its mark. The smack that resounded through the room pulled Lydia back to reality. Lucinda's eyes were stretched wide in surprise. Her behavior was most improper, she realized. Not only had she quarreled with Lucinda immediately in front of Edgar, she had then gone on to strike the Earl. The truth felt unbearable when it hit, and she made to flee, only for Edgar to grab her arm. He pulled her back and into his embrace. She struggled and hit his chest in protest, but he wouldn't let go. Forgive me, Lydia. Just like that, the tension left her. And then, for reasons unbeknownst to her, tears sprang to her eyes. I have erred, he went on. She couldn't see that he had. Lydia had been the one to insist he answer the door, and he had responded to everything Lucinda said as inoffensively as possible. And then the fairy doctor had gone and taken her anger out on him. Yet he still apologized and caressed her hair soothingly. As mortified as she felt, she found herself clinging to him as desperately as she possibly could. This girl seems to have taken leave of her senses, my lord. To think she fancies herself your fiancé. She is my fiancé. Please. I can only imagine the horrendous upbringing she had, given she finds it perfectly acceptable to strike a gentleman. As far as Lydia was concerned, Lucinda could say whatever she liked. It seemed Edgar didn't agree. I shan't allow you to deride her any further. Away with you. Lydia found herself sitting on the sofa, her face buried in Edgar's chest as she cried. At some point, Lucinda had left. She didn't know when. I'm sorry for upsetting you so. It wasn't you. Please, Lydia, don't try to shoulder this burden by yourself. His countless apologies made her feel that she ought to stop crying, but her tears would not be stemmed. I was just so uncertain. I really wanted to work as hard as I possibly could here, but I found it impossible, and then I was at a loss. You are already doing what you ought to be. I am still so far from what a fiancé should be in any sense of the word. You are enough as you are. I am not. I do not know how to be a lover. I know full well that I fall short. I thought that if I undertook Lady Orchard's education, then perhaps I might be able to change. Did I not tell you that I would be satisfied so long as you stayed by my side? The more tightly she clung to him, the more tightly he embraced her. Every apology he whispered into her ear seemed to push out another wave of everything she had been holding back. Her anxieties about the wedding. The inferiority she felt as a commoner. The harassment she had suffered at the hands of Lucinda and the maids. Billy's violence. All the frustration and pain that she couldn't carry by herself. She was beginning to realize that Edgar was there to share it with her, and now she no longer felt the need to force her tears to stop. She clung to him as closely as she could, ridding herself of her weighty burden and feeling it grow lighter. She had feared giving him too many reasons to be disappointed in her. She had wanted to hide her weaknesses from him, but he had said he wanted all of her. Perhaps that meant he desired her vulnerable side too. It would explain why he didn't seem the least bit troubled or exasperated. He was smiling tenderly. Once Lydia had expressed everything she needed to and her tears had dried, she looked up slightly. Edgar returned her gaze as if he were regarding something most precious. Allow me to keep holding you for a while. She stared at him blankly. It brings me no end of joy when you cling to me like this. Oh. He didn't seem inclined to loosen his grip on her, so she wrapped her arms around his back once more. Knowing that it delighted him so much made her want to do it. Might I ask you something, Lydia? Of course, she replied quietly. Would you allow me to be unfaithful to you, if only with a woman you approve of? She paused. I only said that in the passion of the moment. In truth, I couldn't fathom such a thing. You would rather I remain faithful, then? Well, naturally, she stammered, then hardened her tone. Edgar, why are you laughing? Because that is exactly what I was hoping you would say. Sometimes, he could be more child than adult. Lydia couldn't help but think so, despite the fact that she herself had been wailing like an infant just moments ago. At last, she found herself able to look him in the eye. His smile widened and he pecked her on the forehead, just before something seemed to catch his eye outside the window. Lydia heard the sound of a carriage approaching the front of the estate. She came, despite Lady Orchard's absence. It sounded like Edgar knew the visitor's identity. Then, he blinked in realization and murmured, "Ah. Of course. That would explain the tight-lippedness." Lydia could not begin to guess what he was referring to. Suddenly, she remembered that she had her own important news to share, and her head snapped up. Edgar, I know where Lady Orchard is. She has been trapped in the fairies' rose garden. I must bargain with them and rescue her at once. When she tried to get to her feet, Edgar stopped her. You still need rest. Besides, if you must bargain with the fairies for her, I cannot imagine that bringing her ladyship back will be particularly simple. Lydia faltered. She had yet to obtain the secret that would allow her to negotiate with the Danes in the first place. We are running short on time. Striking a deal is the only remaining avenue, regardless of whether I prove capable or not. The fairies are angry and have concluded that humans are not to be trusted. They intend to bury the rose garden with Lady Orchard in it. They are only willing to wait until dawn tomorrow, after the night of the full moon. Edgar nodded, then turned to look out of the window in thought for a while. Billy and his men are not the only dangerous parties lurking within this estate. It was someone else who entered her ladyship's room with a knife. Indeed, Billy thought it was Lydia who had done so. The chances are high that this other party is also targeting her ladyship's jewelry. But stealing the jewelry is impossible. Lady Orchard is still in possession of the regard necklace that acts as the key. Do you mean to say it is in the fairies' rose garden? Yes. There are rules to entering that garden, and attempting to do so without knowing them is dangerous. The fairies will call to one and promise to grant a wish, but they mustn't be answered. I see. Then, her ladyship will not come to any harm tonight. It was clear from Edgar's expression that he had started plotting something. He might have seen this as an opportunity to relieve the resentment that he had built up since his arrival here. Lydia, I shall make a decisive move against the villain who targeted her ladyship before dawn. You must wait until then to make your rescue attempt, lest her escape from the garden places her in even greater danger. Very well, but will you have Raven as your sole ally? You needn't worry about that. I should be able to procure extra assistance. For the time being, just focus on resting. Will you do that for me?